Welcome to Thoughts of War. My name is Bart, a nonviolent follower of Jesus. In this particular video, I want to cover the military census. Now, it may be confusing for many that someone could say they believe in nonviolence, but also agree with the Old Testament. And one of the reasons I actually believe in nonviolence is because the Old Testament gives some clear principles that a nation that chooses to serve God should follow. And one of those is God actually asked Israel, for the most part, to avoid doing a military census. And I'm going to cover that, but this ties in with a lot of other verses in the Old Testament. For example, Deuteronomy 17 talks about God has some requirements for when Israel picks out a king, and it says the king cannot go and collect horses. It cannot marry many wives and cannot collect gold and silver for themselves. Well, if you think about that, those are all things needed for a successful military. You have to have horses to pull chariots or to have cavalry. You have to marry foreign women to make alliances with. That's just the way you make alliances in those days. So you couldn't make alliances for peace with pagan kings. And also, you couldn't connect gold and silver. So you couldn't buy yourself out with like mercenaries or pay off one king to defend you. So the fact that God removed these things from the nation of Israel made them where they had to depend on him. Matter of fact, even in Deuteronomy 20, whenever the whole army shows up, God says, hey, you should tell them all and say, hey, if anyone just does not want to fight today, if you're afraid, go home. And we see this even for the example like with Gideon. Started off with 30,000 men, and God's like, that's too many people. If you win with that many people, you're going to take credit for yourselves. You're not going to give God the glory for the victory. So, God eventually got that number down to 300, where it'd obviously be a miraculous sign from God if they were to win a military victory. So one of the reasons I believe in nonviolence today is because I look at these Old Testament principles that God had for the nation of Israel, and I see that no nation, at least I'm not aware of. If you're aware of someone or a nation in the past that's implemented these principles, put it in the comments. I really want to know. But all nations today, even the ones that claim to be Christian, all ignore these principles. And these were all things that God laid out. And that if you were going to be a military that was in a sense going to fight the battles the way he wants battles to be fought, was you did not do military census. So you didn't know when you went into war how many people was actually going to go into war with you. So you couldn't plan strategy. You were to ask your volunteers if they wanted to go home, that they could go home. You were to not have the advanced technology of the day, the horses and the chariots. You weren't supposed to have silver and gold. That also prevents you from buying the best weapons available. So pretty much you couldn't make alliances. So Israel couldn't make alliances with pagan nations. They weren't supposed to depend on Egypt for protection, or depend on Assyria, or depend on any other group for their protection. They were supposed to rely solely on God. So when you take these things away and you take these principles, you would think that after the Messiah came, that these principles would still be true. That if any nation claimed to be a Christian nation, then they would not do a military census. If they did, they'd recognize it as a sin and have to ask for forgiveness as a nation as a whole. If they would not be seeking advanced weapons, they would not be making alliances with nations that are not Christian. And so, as far as I'm aware of, I'm not aware of any nations today that follow these principles. And one of my videos I did earlier, if you look at my Flag Day and nonviolence, I bring up one of the reasons I do not think America is a Christian nation is because one of the things it does is it actually does a census. Now the census it does today, you can say a lot of it's for economic reasons, but even originally it did have some military reasons behind it, and we still count our troops. We still know if you're 18 years old, whenever any boy, they have to register with the selective service in case there is a draft in the future. Again, we can go through all of this in future videos, but today I just want to cover a military census. And if you've not heard about it being a great sin against God, stick with these videos. I'm hoping they'll make sense to you as we go through it. And so First, a little bit about the United States Census. This is 2020, so this is the year I'm making this video. The United States is currently going through a census. Now, every 10 years, the United States has to do a census because it's mandated in Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution of the United States. And so the first census to actually take place was in 1790, and it only asked 6 questions. So it asked the name of the head of the family, and needed to know the number of free white males of 16 years and upward. So this is to know the country's industrial and military potential. And then also ask about the number of free white males under 16, the number of free females, the number of all other free persons, and the number of slaves. And all this I received from census.gov, just looking at the history. So notice in 1790, this is straight from the census.gov, that it says that they want to take this census to understand what the military strength was, which seems strange to me because look at my Flag Day and nonviolence video. But for me, to be a Christian nation, to me, would be someone that does not need to do a census, or at least if you do a census, you have to recognize it is a sin against God to do that. But let's keep going. I think it will make more sense as we keep going. So let's jump right into the verse. Where am I getting this from? Am I making this up? Exodus 30, verses 12 through 16. When you take a census of the Israelites to register them, each of the men must pay a ransom for his life to the Lord as they are registered. Then no plague will come on them as they are registered. Everyone who is registered must pay half a shekel according to the sanctuary shekel, which is 20 gerahs to the shekel. This half shekel is a contribution to the Lord. Each man who is registered 20 years old or more must give this contribution to the Lord. The wealthy may not give more, and the poor may not give less than half a shekel when giving the contribution to the Lord to atone to your lives. Take the atonement price from the Israelites and use it for the service of the tent of meeting. It will serve as a reminder for the Israelites before the Lord to atone for your lives. So just a couple terms I want to throw out. I want to go back and look at those verses again. Notice that word ransom. Now, when I think of ransom, I think of those Hollywood movies where they kidnap a wealthy kid, and if you don't pay the ransom, you know that kid's going to die. Or they kidnap just any person. You've got to pay that ransom. It's the way to get that person's life back. But if you don't pay it, that person will be killed. That's the price for a life. And then also plague. When you think of plague too, I often think of like the Black Plague, Black Death. It's a disease, in that it's something that will kill. And so what's interesting, going back to this verse and look at it, when you take a census of the Israelites to register them, each of the men must pay a ransom for his life. So that means if that man takes part of a census, the moment he does that, it's almost like he's been taken captive and he's going to be killed. In a sense, he is under the judgment of God, and he's under the plague that God has now set forth over the nation of Israel for taking a census. The only way to not be part of that plague is to pay a ransom. So God's pretty serious about this, because he's not just saying, don't do this. He's saying, if you do this, I will strike you. You will feel my wrath if you take a census. And so notice that this is focused on those on the military. Look in verse 14. Each man who is registered 20 years old or more. That is the military age for someone in the nation of Israel. And so we'll keep going with this. Another term I want to bring out is atone. This word atone is used 3 different times. And atone means to cover over. And what are they having to cover over? They're having to cover over a sin. So when you think of the word atonement or atone, you're having to do something to cover over a sin. So what sin did they commit? The sin they committed was doing a census. So that's why there was a plague that could be put on them. So in verse 15 it says, the wealthy may not give more than the poor, and the poor may not give less than half a shekel when given the contribution to the Lord to atone for your life. So it doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, you've got to atone for your life. You have to cover up the sin that now that's happened. And it says, take the atonement price from the Israelites and use it for the service of the tent of meeting. So here's another important thing. You couldn't take this money and use it to go buy weapons, or this wasn't for the king to use to support his war machine. He had to take money economically from his people, and he had to put them into the temple, or he had to put them into the tent of meeting. So he had to actually give that as a service to God. And a lot of that money would go towards, I guess, to ministries that was used by the Levitical priest. And I've talked about this in other videos, that the Levitical priests were not numbered with the military, and were not part of the military census. So, because they were supposed to focus on the things of God. And so here we go. It says, it will serve as a reminder of the Israelites before before the Lord, to atone for your lives. Again, 3 times this atone or atonement is mentioned here, and that is, you have to cover. It's to cover over a sin. So God's pretty serious about this. He's so serious about this. I don't know many other times where He's like, if you do this as a nation, I will strike you with a plague. He's pretty specific here. So let's keep going. So we actually see this take place later on in the scriptures. So this is several centuries later. We have David's military census, and you can read about this. If you want to pause this and go read these. I'm not going to cover the whole chapters. We don't have time for that. But there's 2 Samuel 24 and 1 Chronicles 21. Go and look those up. But I'm just going to pull out a few verses from here just to show the evilness or the sinfulness of having a military census. So then it says, so the king said to Joab, the commander of his army, go through all the tribes of Israel from Dan to Beersheba and register the troops so I can know their number. Joab replied to the king, may the Lord your God multiply the troops 100 times more than they are, while my lord the king looks on. But why does my lord the king want to do this? Yet the king's order prevailed over Joab and the king and the commanders of the army. So Joab and the commanders of the army left the king's presence to register the troops of Israel. So just to note here, Joab would be like the top general for David. And Joab sees this as an evil command. He's like, why are you doing this, David? This is not good. And it's not just Joab that knew that this was something you should not do. Notice it said the king's orders prevailed over Joab and the commanders of the army. So all the commanders of David's army, they were all saying, no, you do not want to do this. This is not good. This is going to bring about the wrath of God. We don't want to go here. We are dependent on God for our victories. We're not dependent on the number of troops we have. God has blessed us militarily. Why do you want to count your soldiers now? This is not good. But, David's the king, and they followed his command. So David's conscience in verse 10 says it troubled him after he had taken a census of the troops. He said to the Lord, I have sinned greatly in what I've done. Now, Lord, I've been very foolish. Please take away your servant's guilt. And we'll go through 15 through 17. So this is what ended up happening. The Lord sent a plague, like he said he was going to do, on Israel from that morning until the appointed time. And from Dan to Beersheba, 70,000 men died. Then the angel extended his hand toward Jerusalem to destroy it. But the Lord relented concerning the destruction and said to the angel who was destroying the people, enough, withdraw your hand now. The angel of the Lord was then at the threshing floor of Araunah, the Jebusite. When David saw the angel striking the people, he said to the Lord, look, I am the one who has sinned. I am the one who has done wrong. But these sheep, what have they done? Please let your hand be against me and my father's family. So here you actually see the plague that came struck 70,000 men. And also took just these few verses from 1 Chronicles, and it says that Joab gave the total troop registration in David. And all Israel, there were 1,100,000 armed men in Judah, itself 470,000 armed men. But he did not include the Levi and the Benjamin in the count because the king's command was detestable to him. Just again, you see how Joab was just did not want to do this. And then it says, this command was also evil in God's sight. So he afflicted Israel. So you see both in Chronicles and in 2 Samuel that this is a sin. And the people knew it. The generals, they knew it. They knew that whenever you go and you fight, you are supposed to rely on God, not your number of troops. And they knew this was not good. And to me, this is kind of strange because my whole life I've never heard any sermons preached on this, and especially that it applies to any modern time. So one reason I would say that I'm nonviolent now is because if I think Christians were to fight, they would have to follow these principles. And I understand we're not under the law, and we're not required to obey, especially the civil law of the Old Testament. But I think there are principles in the Old Testament. And I think that the kingdom that the Messiah established, these principles would go even further. And what I mean by that is, you look at the Sermon on the Mount. You committed a sin, not just physically committing adultery, but just looking and having the lust, then it's like you have already committed adultery. Just having the anger makes you guilty of murder and sin. So the Messiah's kingdom, the kingdom of God, demanded more, or you think would be even more. How would you say it? It would be more than what God gave to the nation of Israel. So I would think for sure, if somebody was to claim to be a Christian nation, then even for sure you would not do a military census. But this is why I don't believe that there is a Christian nation, and there's not been in 2,000 years, because they do not follow even this basic principle of not doing a military census. So why was it a sin against God? Which, by the way, if you don't understand this, a lot of people will just say, well, David was prideful and God was judging God for his pride. Yes, that is true. But also, God did not want the nation of Israel. God commanded this of all the kings. He didn't want them to be militaristic. And so the nation of Israel was to be solely dependent on God for military victory. God had just delivered Israel from the superpower of the day, Egypt, whenever he gave this command to Moses. And so here, I already mentioned this, but God did not want the nation of Israel to be militaristic like many of the nations that surround them. You have to think, most of the nations surrounding them, those kings, they knew how many soldiers they had, and they would try to count how many soldiers the other army had, and they would know, hey, I could probably have victory. If I've got 50,000 men and they only got 20,000 men, then we can go and we can take their possessions, we can take their fields, we can take their cities. And so God did not want the nation of Israel to be like that. He didn't want them to be thinking, hey, we can go and conquer these other nations because look at how many men we have versus how many men they've got. Because it's not about how many men you have. It's about who your God is. And they serve the one true God. So even like with Gideon, even if you go and you have to fight tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, if God's asking you to do it, it doesn't matter if you only got 20 men or 300 men or 1,000 men. As long as you're doing what God asks you to do, you'll have the victory. And it says we see this also in other commands that we get to in future videos. So I mentioned some of those already about the king not having to go get horses or marrying foreign women, making those alliances with pagan nations, with the collecting gold and silver for yourselves, the asking the volunteer army to, if you want to go home. So I'm going to cover some of that in future videos. And so from a nonviolent perspective, this is where I'm coming from. So God was asking his people, even back then, to have faith that God's going to meet their needs. And that's not just faith that God's going to make sure that they got food, that they got clothing, that God's going to make sure they're protected, even militarily. And they had to just depend on God for that. They didn't need to worry about how big the army, how big was Egypt, how big was Syria, how big was Babylon. If they just had their faith in God, God was going to take care of them. And for example, you see that when Sennacherib marches against the gates of Jerusalem, God sends his angel and strikes his army. It says if God required his people to be non-militaristic, then to me, it's not a surprise that the Messiah was to be the Prince of Peace. It's not that Jesus came riding on a donkey, that he was humble. It's not surprising to me that he was someone who brought peace to this world, that he would be known as the Prince of Peace. because even back with Israel, they weren't supposed to be this nation that just conquered kingdom after kingdom, and they weren't supposed to be a nation that God did not want to conquer this world through its military. God could have very easily conquered this whole world through the military of Israel. But that's not the kingdom that God wanted to establish. He wanted a kingdom that would be like his son, the Messiah, who'd be willing to suffer and be willing to lay down their lives. And they go from city to city, to village, just sharing the good news that the Messiah has come, this Prince of Peace. And so the sin of a military census confirms to me that the God of the Old Testament is the same as the God of the New Testament. You can see that. You can see how where things were building. Even with those prophecies in Isaiah and Micah that prophesy about out of Jerusalem is going to go forth the law, then it's going to be people will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. You'll see that this is the same God, that the same Jesus, he perfectly lines up with the Old Testament. And you can see this because what nation, even in Israel's time, what nation did this? What nation said, we're not going to count our troops. We're going to tell people to go home when they show up to battle. We're not going to collect horses. If we get horses, say we have a military victory and we get all these horses in chariots, we're just going to destroy them because we're going to put our faith on God. I mean, what military did that? This proves to me that Israel was serving the one true God. And this proves to me, too, that, here, I'll put a little pause here. If some nation today says that, that God's behind them, implement these things. If any nation, if it's be it a Muslim or a Hindu, any nation, it's kind of like implement these things. Because if a nation implements these principles, somebody's behind them supernaturally. It's definitely not humans because we know, with the way we think with our military strategy that, if 300 went against, hundreds of thousands and the 301, you're going to stop and think and be like, whoa, something doesn't make sense here. There's got to be something that's supernatural. And you have to think, when God did this, why do you think he did all these things? These nations, when they were defeated by the nation of Israel, this little small army, they had to stop and think, hey, our God failed us. Our God failed us, and there was just a few hundred of these Israelites, and our God failed us. Our walls, they're so strong, so thick, so strong. How could their God penetrate our walls? So they had to stop and think about, or like same thing with Egypt being destroyed. They had to think about, why could all of these Egyptian gods not protect them from this one God of these slaves? People had to think about this when they were defeated by the Israeli military or the nation of Israel. And in the Old Testament, if they were doing things the way God would ask them to do, the people had to think and consider that their God was false and the God of the Jews was true, and they had the opportunity to repent of their sins, to cast their idols aside, and to join God even back then. Just for example, like Rahab. And so, to me, if there was such a thing as a Christian nation, would it not also have to agree that a military census would be a great sin against God? And this is something I just do not see today from the pulpits. I don't see... and maybe I will someday, but I don't see YouTubers, I don't see preachers coming out and saying, America's creating this great evil because we keep counting our soldiers. We keep doing having them sign up for a draft potential. To me, this is one of the ways that shows that that America was not a Christian nation at its founding, because to me this military census is a great evil to God. And for us not to see that as a great evil, it means we must have missed God somewhere in the Old Testament. We must have missed these principles. And so, which is scary to me, because now what did God say he would do to a nation that did the census? He says he would send a plague on them. So to me, this is scary. This isn't something we should play around with. That God, for a nation that doesn't depend on him for victory, but they say they depend on him, but they really don't because of their actions. See, that's one thing. I will not say that America has not always claimed to be a Christian nation, or that many claim to be a Christian nation. Israel, I'm sure, claimed to be a godly nation. But the thing is, look at what they did. If they did not actually put their faith in him and rely on him, then, and they actually had to put this in practice. They actually had to not do a military census. And if they did a military census, they had to atone for it because they had to realize it was a sin. So anyway, I want to keep going over this, but you kind of see where I'm going from. How about you? Have you heard anybody preach sermons on this? What do you think about this? I'm going to try to cover some modern news on the current census. And I said, this is something I think all modern nations do. They count their armies, and they see how many soldiers they have when they try to look at competing against other militaries. But anyway, so hopefully this video helped you out, especially in understanding God's wrath on Israel during the time of David and his census. So anyway, please come back. I'll try to do some more Old Testament videos. But anyway, thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.